Stockholm, November 14, 1946. The air inside the Grand Concert Hall is thick with anticipation, a mix of post-war relief and the solemn weight of scientific prestige. On stage, men in crisp tuxedos adjust their collars under the warm lights. The world's cameras and microphones are trained on this single point, a beacon of intellectual progress in a world still clearing the rubble of its own destructive genius. The secretary of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences steps forward, his voice echoing through the chamber, announcing the recipient of the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for the year 1944, a prize delayed by global conflict. The award is for one of the most consequential discoveries in human history, the discovery of the fission of heavy nuclei. The name announced is Otto Hahn. The world applauded, and it was an applause that reverberated with profound meaning. This wasn't just another scientific prize. This was for the discovery that had unlocked the atom, the discovery that had led directly to the mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki a year earlier, and the discovery that now promised a future of limitless energy. Otto Hahn, the stoic German chemist, was celebrated as the man who single-handedly deciphered this terrifying secret of the universe. He was the hero of the hour, the lone pioneer. But even as the champagne flowed and the headlines were printed, a deep and unsettling silence hung over the physics community. In the quiet corridors of universities from Princeton to Copenhagen, in hushed conversations and frustrated letters, a question was being asked, a name was being whispered. It was the name of a woman who had been Hahn's closest scientific partner for over 30 years, a physicist of such brilliance that Albert Einstein himself had called her our Marie Curie. Her name was Lise Meitner. This wasn't a case of a minor contributor being overlooked. This was the intellectual architect of the discovery being written out of her own story. For 3 decades, the partnership of Meitner and Hahn had been a powerhouse in nuclear physics. She was the theorist, the physicist who guided the experimental path. He was the master chemist who executed the meticulous experiments. Their Berlin laboratory was a place of legend. Yet, in 1946, only one of them stood in Stockholm. The official narrative presented a simple, clean story. A brilliant chemist makes a world-changing discovery. The reality, meticulously documented in archives and personal correspondence, was a tangled, tragic story of political terror, forced exile, deep-seated sexism, and a betrayal that would stain the legacy of the Nobel Prize forever. To understand the magnitude of this injustice, we must understand the nature of their collaboration. It was not a hierarchy, it was a symbiosis. Hahn himself had admitted on numerous occasions that he was lost without Meitner's physical insights to guide his chemical results. So how, in the final accounting of history, did the partnership vanish? How did the physicist who provided the map, who identified the destination, and who explained the meaning of the treasure get erased from the story of its discovery? How could such a fundamental breakthrough, one that reshaped geopolitics and physics forever, be credited to only one part of the team, especially when the key intellectual architect was forced into exile at the very moment of revelation? The answer begins not in the sterile environment of a laboratory, but in the brutal, chaotic landscape of Nazi Germany. It's a story of how systemic evil can seep into the very practice of science, twisting the pursuit of truth into a mechanism for lies. The Nobel Committee wasn't just rewarding a scientific paper. They were ratifying a narrative crafted under the immense pressure of a totalitarian regime. They were accepting a version of history that had been deliberately edited to exclude a Jewish woman. The prize given to Hahn was not merely an oversight. It was the final formal act of an intellectual cleansing that had begun years earlier. It cemented a fiction that would persist for decades, a fiction that portrayed Lise Meitner as, at best, a junior assistant, and at worst, a footnote. The world celebrated a man for a discovery he famously admitted he did not understand, while the woman who did understand it was left to read about the ceremony in a Swedish newspaper, a ghost at her own feast. What forces conspire to make this erasure not just possible, but palatable to the highest arbiters of scientific achievement? Following that glaring omission in Stockholm, our investigation must rewind the clock, pushing back through the smoke of war to a single pivotal year, 1938. The world is on a knife's edge, and so is Lise Meitner. For months, she, a brilliant physicist of Jewish heritage, had been living on borrowed time in Berlin. The Nuremberg laws had stripped her of her professorship, but her Austrian citizenship had offered a fragile shield. Then, in March 1938, the Anschluss, Germany's annexation of Austria, occurred. Overnight, Lise Meitner became a German citizen, subject to the full horror of the Nazi regime. Her life was in immediate danger. Her colleagues, including Otto Hahn, grew distant, fearful of the consequences of associating with her. A desperate, clandestine escape was planned. With only a few marks in her pocket and a diamond ring from Hahn to be used as a bribe, she was smuggled across the Dutch border, leaving behind her home, her laboratory, her life's work, and the very experiments that were on the cusp of a breakthrough. She eventually found a tenuous refuge in Stockholm, a scientist without a lab, without resources, and consumed by a profound sense of isolation and loss. It is from this place of exile, a small hotel room in the Swedish town of Kungälv during the Christmas holiday, that the crucial breakthrough would come. Back in their Berlin lab, Hahn and his younger colleague Fritz Strassmann continued the experiments Meitner had designed. They were bombarding uranium, the heaviest known element, with slow neutrons. The goal, based on the prevailing physics of the time, was to create even heavier transuranic elements. But their results were bizarre, nonsensical. Instead of heavier elements, they kept finding what appeared to be barium, an element roughly half the mass of uranium. It was chemically undeniable, but physically impossible. It was like throwing a cannonball at a fortress wall and ending up with two bicycles. As a chemist, Hahn was baffled and frustrated. He wrote a now famous letter to Meitner, his exiled partner, describing his bewildering findings. "Perhaps you can come up with some fantastic explanation," he wrote. "We ourselves realize it can't actually burst apart into barium." That letter, filled with raw data and deep confusion, was the catalyst. From her remote refuge, Meitner received Hahn's letter. She was walking in the snow-covered woods with her nephew, the physicist Otto Robert Frisch, who was visiting for the holiday. As they discussed Hahn's impossible results, a revolutionary idea began to form. Meitner recalled the liquid drop model of the atomic nucleus, a theory that pictured the nucleus behaving like a wobbly drop of water. She realized that the uranium nucleus, when struck by a neutron, might not just chip or crack, it might become so unstable that it elongates and then splits in two, much like a biological cell dividing. This was the ghost experiment, a purely theoretical leap made hundreds of miles from the actual laboratory. Sitting on a log in the Swedish snow, they sketched out the physics on scraps of paper. They calculated the immense energy that would be released in this process, using Einstein's famous equation, E equals mc squared, to show that the slight loss of mass when the nucleus split would be converted into a staggering amount of energy. They had not only explained Hahn's results, they had uncovered a new force of nature. Frisch returned to Copenhagen and confirmed the energy release experimentally. And together, he and Meitner wrote the seminal paper explaining the physics of the process, coining the term that would define an age, nuclear fission. But while Meitner and Frisch were preparing their physics paper for publication in Phi, Hahn, under pressure in Germany, rushed his chemical findings into print in Chi. He published without Meitner's name on the paper, a decision he later justified by claiming the Nazi regime would not have allowed a publication co-authored by a Jewish scientist. This may have been true, a painful necessity of the time. But what followed was not. In his paper, he presented the discovery as a feat of chemistry alone, framing Meitner's decades of foundational work and her crucial immediate explanation as something peripheral. As the world reeled from the implications of their discovery, this initial political compromise hardened into a systematic campaign of erasure. In lectures, interviews, and his own Nobel address, Hahn consistently minimized and eventually omitted Meitner's role. He constructed a narrative of a lone chemist who stumbled upon a discovery so strange that the physicists, including his former partner, were too stuck in old paradigms to see the truth. The historical record, preserved in their own letters, proves this to be a complete fabrication. How did this political turmoil and a colleague's profound failure of courage intertwine so completely as to erase her scientific primacy from the most important discovery of the 20th century? From those frantic letters exchanged across a war-torn continent and the groundbreaking calculations sketched on scrap paper in a snowy wood, the atomic age emerged, a world forever changed by the power Lise Meitner's mind had unveiled. The implications were immediate and terrifying. News of fission spread like wildfire through the global physics community. Scientists understood at once that if a splitting uranium atom released neutrons that could split other atoms, a chain reaction was possible, unleashing energy on a scale previously unimaginable. This led directly to the Allied race to build an atomic bomb, the Manhattan Project. Meitner, horrified by the potential weaponization of her discovery, was invited to join the project at Alamosos. Her response was swift and absolute: "I will have nothing to do with a bomb." This principled stand, this refusal to turn her pure science into a weapon of mass destruction, stands in stark contrast to many of her male contemporaries. She was a woman of profound integrity, one who saw the moral implications of her work with a clarity that others lacked. While Hahn accepted the Nobel Prize in a world still grappling with the ashes of Hiroshima, Meitner was quietly advocating for the peaceful and responsible use of atomic energy. The Nobel Committee's decision to exclude her remains one of the most egregious and well-documented failures in its history. This was not a simple oversight. The Nobel archives, opened decades later, reveal a complex and damning story. Meitner was nominated for the prize an astonishing 48 times throughout her career, for both physics and chemistry. Niels Bohr, one of the giants of 20th century physics, repeatedly wrote to the committee, trying to explain that the discovery was an inseparable combination of Hahn's chemistry and Meitner's physics. But the institutional gatekeepers were deaf to his pleas. The committee was hobbled by its own rigid disciplinary boundaries, unable to properly evaluate a discovery that spanned two fields. Furthermore, a key member of the physics committee, Manne Siegbahn, held a personal and professional prejudice against Meitner, actively working to block her candidacy. This was compounded by the pervasive unspoken sexism of the era, an environment where it was simply easier to award the prize to the senior man who had stayed in his lab than to the exiled woman who had provided the critical intellectual insight. Hahn's role in this is tragic and complex. In his Nobel lecture, he barely mentioned Meitner's name, cementing the false narrative of his solo discovery. While he would later, in private and in his memoirs, give her more credit, the public damage was done. The official record, sanctioned by the Nobel Prize, had been written, and her name was not in it. The systemic failure was complete. It took decades for history to begin its slow, arduous process of correction. Biographies were written, the letters between Meitner and Hahn were published, revealing the truth of their collaboration in their own words. The scientific community began to speak more openly about the Meitner problem. In 1966, she, Hahn, and Strassman were jointly awarded the U.S. Fermi Award, a partial but significant acknowledgement of her role. But the ultimate, posthumous recognition came in 1997, when element 109, one of the heaviest on the periodic table, was officially named Meitnerium. It was a fitting tribute, a fundamental piece of matter named for a woman who had discovered a fundamental truth about it. Her legacy is now undeniable, but the story of its suppression serves as a stark and enduring reminder. It forces us to ask, how many other foundational discoveries remain misattributed? How many other brilliant minds have been left in the shadows because the institutional mechanisms of credit and recognition were biased against them? The fight to remember Lise Meitner is not just about correcting a single historical wrong. It is about recalibrating our understanding of how science truly happens, not as the work of lone male geniuses, but as a messy, collaborative, and deeply human endeavor. Her story reminds us that acknowledging the true architects of progress isn't just a matter of fairness, it is essential to the integrity of science itself.